Hi there, my name is Giles Cross and I am ISEAL Associate Manager for Content Strategy. And in today's podcast, I am talking with Patrick Mallet about the evolution of global supply chains and due diligence, and how credible sustainability systems are helping companies to comply with the law while also guiding positive social and environmental impacts. So welcome, Patrick. I wonder if you'd like to introduce yourself and then we'll dive into the questions.
Great. Good to be here. So I am the Credibility and Innovations Director at ISEAL. I oversee a lot of our technical work, our good practice guides, and also looking at a lot at where sustainability systems need to evolve and how they can improve and adapt to meet changing expectations of companies and governments. So that's why this topic is particularly relevant.
Brilliant. Thanks, Patrick. I guess it's always good to just dive in with kind of an overview just to sort of set the scene for what we're going to discuss. So maybe you can tell me a bit about what at ISEAL we feel we mean by corporate due diligence and just kind of where the whole space is sitting at the moment, and just get a sense of the background and how that might affect some of the thematics we'll come on to later on.
Yeah, and it's actually quite a dynamic space. I mean, there's really two main parts of corporate due diligence, or two main components where, originally due diligence was a financial thing, and it was about companies making sure that they had their financial due diligence in place. But more recently, it's built out to encompass ethical considerations, sustainability considerations, and thinking, that the two components are, on the one hand, there's the narrow definition of, for companies, this is a process by which they can identify, manage, and minimize their business risks. But then if you look at somewhere like the OECD, it's much more about due diligence as a duty or obligation to take reasonable steps to avoid harm to others. And we see both of those interpretations coming through in different regulations. And it's interesting to see how that manifests and what that then means for sustainability systems and the roles they can play.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I find that interplay between the legislation and between the actual kind of sense of harm and risk for business, and I suppose fundamentally profits, maybe compared with what businesses might be doing from an ethical standpoint, is really intriguing. But maybe we'll come back to that, and I'll just ask you to outline a couple of the types of due diligence we tend to be looking at in this space.
In the context of due diligence, if we look at EUDR first, that's a good example of the narrow interpretation where it's due diligence as a company needing to understand where its supply is coming from and ensure that there is no deforestation and that practices are in compliance with legal laws and regulations. So it's a legality piece and a deforestation piece, but it's basically it's the narrow sense because it is about avoiding that those things are in your supply chain. So it's mitigating the risk by avoiding them. Whereas if you look at something like CSDDD or OECD, it's much more about this second definition where we're looking at how can a company understand its impacts in its supply chain, not only understand the level of risk associated with different issues, but take responsibility for managing or mitigating those risks over time. So if there are human rights abuses, it's not just about identifying it and getting it out of your supply chain. It's actually about taking responsibility for that, seeing how you can improve your practices over time.
Yeah, cool. That makes good sense. And I think this is probably where we can start getting into the nitty-gritty of this stuff a bit more when we start thinking about the timescales involved and the levels of involvement that certain corporates either want to or are being forced to or are willing to take. So maybe we can begin to touch on, I guess, expectations that are evolving for companies across reporting and disclosure and due diligence obligations. And maybe we'll dive in a bit deeper and look at how the obligations match up with what the companies want to do or choose to do and see what we can learn in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really interesting. There's this narrow focus on due diligence as a regulatory responsibility, but it's part of
Mm,
this bigger
yeah.
transition where companies are increasingly needing to respond to reporting and disclosure obligations, sometimes
Mm,
voluntary, sometimes
yeah. Yeah.
mandatory. And so companies are really trying to figure out what is the role or what are their responsibilities in relation to some of these critical sustainability issues,
Mm,
whether
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
nature reporting or climate scope 3 or emissions reductions
Yeah.
reporting. But you know, looking at that in the context of due diligence, it is really about how can a company reduce and manage the negative impacts caused by its activities or its supply
Hmm.
chain.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think we're more than starting, we are on this path where we will see increasingly expectations on companies of different sizes, not just the largest leading
Mm,
companies, but
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
other ones as well, to be better at responsibly managing their operations and dealing with some of the issues and looking at those sustainability impacts in more detail. And I think that's where the link
Mm,
with
sure.
sustainability systems becomes so interesting.
Do you feel the expectation of how far we can go on due diligence is that kind of being driven by the shareholder side of stuff or the profit angle? And how much of that is just down to the legislative demand, and how much are companies really, I guess, embracing this stuff? And maybe what kind of impact that has for sustainability systems as well. Quite how far down the path companies want to be going, I guess, is what I'm driving at.
It's an interesting question at this point in time. You know, we've seen a lot of pushback in the last
Mm,
6
yeah, yeah.
months to a year, particularly on regulations in the EU, around due diligence and some of the other reporting requirements, um, in a way that has in some ways sidelined
Mm,
these
mm,
conversations and this
yeah.
trajectory. I think ultimately this is a blip where the move towards companies being held responsible for their impacts
Mm,
will only increase in importance. We are still seeing mostly that companies are engaging from a risk management perspective,
yeah,
but
got it.
increasingly it's about resilience and security of supply, you know,
Hmm.
particularly when supply chains become tenuous. One of the ways of better managing for those is taking responsibility for understanding and managing the risks associated with that supply. So I think
Hmm.
from that perspective, this is something that is going to increase in importance for companies. How
Yeah,
quickly
yeah.
the legislative or regulatory environment moves,
Mm,
it's hard to say. But you know, still there are other jurisdictions outside the EU that are making
yeah,
good
yeah.
progress on these types of laws. Um, from a sustainability systems
Mm,
perspective, it is inevitable that sustainability systems will need to adapt their systems to be
yeah.
better able to serve the needs of companies and
Hmm.
of governments in meeting those kinds of regulatory and reporting expectations. And that's a shift that we're already seeing many
Mm, yeah,
sustainability
yeah.
systems making.
Within global supply chains, it can be challenging to define quite who is responsible for owning the issue, whether that's the corporate or the kind of local
Yeah.
legislative approach. Do you have any thoughts on that and quite how that situation is evolving, or what any potential solutions might be to this? I guess this ownership issue is something that I sense is kind of a bit of a tricky spot in the background.
What is interesting is to put that question in this longer time horizon of the
Yeah, yeah.
rise and role of voluntary standards versus regulatory measures, where
Yeah.
voluntary standards emerged precisely because governments were abdicating their responsibilities around social and
Mm,
environmental performance in the markets. Now that they're coming back and starting to play a more active role, that's why sustainability systems may need to adapt their own roles. I do think
yeah.
ultimately this happens through regulatory ownership. So through
Hmm.
governments at whatever level taking
Yeah, yeah.
responsibility and saying, markets, yes, free markets are good, but we do need to set expectations around performance and responsibility. And that to the extent that we're in a position where governments do take a
Mm,
proactive
mm,
role, then it is much more about how are companies positioning themselves to respond to that, but also to position themselves in the market, and how
yeah,
can
yeah.
sustainability systems support them to do that?
Absolutely. I'd just be intrigued to learn a bit more about some of the detail in that space of what makes sustainability systems so effective in that
It,
supporting role to companies.
Well, and okay, so first of all, the supporting role I think is important. One of the things we want to be clear is that sustainability systems don't offer a green lane for companies.
Mm,
They're not a way for companies to advocate their own responsibility for doing their due diligence. But
yeah.
sustainability systems are particularly well placed to support companies in that journey. And they already do a number of things that are critical or useful for a company in its due diligence process.
Mm,
Things like having transparency in the supply
yeah.
chain,
Yeah. Yeah.
knowing who the actors are, and actually having a system in place, traceability or chain of custody systems
Yeah.
that show the flow of product and can enable companies to know where their supply is coming from. That's very basic, but that supply chain provenance is particularly important for different due diligence regulations. Building on that, then there's
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
things that systems already have in place around understanding the level of risk. So,
Uh-huh.
one of the
Okay.
key tenets in due diligence is understanding the risks in your supply chains. And for sustainability systems, the audit process is
Mm,
essentially gathering data about where are those risks of non-compliance. And so that
yeah.
information in itself, whether it's for deforestation or human rights, is very useful for a company to gain insight.
Hmm.
Where some of the sustainability systems are moving is
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
only to play the compliance role, but
Mm,
actually to take responsibility for mitigating some of those risks through the strategies that they put in place
mm,
in addition to certification. So think, for
yeah.
example, a
Yeah.
lot of sustainability systems focused on improvement pathways. So it's not just a
Yeah.
pass fail compliance, but rather where are the issues? How do clients in the supply chain
Mm.
improve on those issues over time so that ultimately we're talking about addressing and mitigating the risks that companies have in their supply chains?
I sense that audits are incredibly useful, but they can also be a challenge, right, at the same time. And they can be burdensome, but they can also provide incredible, meaningful, useful metrics that we need, right, to work stuff
Yeah.
out. Anything to say on that? Just the balance between those two, the elements of burden and the element of usefulness is always kind of an intriguing interplay there.
It is. And I mean, this is again such a topical question because not only are sustainability systems responding to the changing regulatory environment, but they're
Yeah, yeah.
responding to changing expectations around how data and technology are informing assessment of performance. And so
Mm,
this is
yeah.
it's a bigger question that goes beyond due diligence, but is very much a recognition exactly that audits have been cumbersome and costly and not particularly good at understanding performance over
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing and what ISEAL supports is that sustainability systems are making fundamental shifts in what the assessment process looks like. So, where
Hmm.
it was
Okay.
traditionally an audit at a point in time giving
Yeah.
a snapshot of performance, it is now very much more about collating multiple data sources to
Hmm.
get more real-time understanding, not only of where what is the performance, but where are the risks. And you can
Mm,
imagine that as
I'm with you.
technology gets integrated into these processes, whether
Yeah.
that's AI or otherwise, we
Hmm.
start to move towards even predictive analysis of
Yeah.
anticipated risks so that we can address the problems before they happen. And that type
Cool.
of thing, I think, is the way that we shift the value proposition, because that trade-off
Mhm.
is exactly about value proposition. And what
Yeah. I'm with
we
you.
and all of the sustainability systems we work with are trying to do is get to a place where the value derived both for the consumer or the supply chain company and
Mm,
for the client or enterprise being
mm,
certified,
yeah, yeah.
that value proposition is sufficient to make this a meaningful investment. So farmers or
Mhm.
enterprises are
Yeah.
also getting value back from the assessment process.
Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. I find it intriguing what you mentioned about various different elements coming together. That's kind of whether that's the AI side or other sides of auditing, I guess coming together to kind of create a holistic whole. It reminds me of when I did some work on satellite monitoring for deforestation in the
Mhm.
Amazon a few years back. And, it couldn't do everything. You still needed the people on the ground. But it was touching on that space where can we use these models in the future to say that's how much forest we're expecting to lose
Yeah.
in the jungles in Peru over the next 5 years, and then how is that predictive model shaping up against what's happening in the real world and against what's happening with the guys on the ground going out there and just monitoring the changes day to day.
Yeah, and if I'm just to speak to that briefly, I
Yeah, yeah.
really do think that by having better information about where those risks are, then when you
Yeah.
put somebody on the ground, whether it's an auditor or some community monitoring, that they can then focus where the risks are highest. So it's much more targeted. It's not
Mm.
necessary that the auditor does a full assessment of all the compliance criteria, but rather focuses on the issues that matter most.
Anything to say about sustainability systems and their challenges in this space?
Well, so one of the pieces we haven't talked much about yet is on traceability.
Okay.
And again, many sustainability systems are making significant improvements to their traceability systems. These are
Yeah, yeah.
already some of the strongest supply chain traceability and transparency tools that we have. But the challenge that systems are needing to play with is that if you're a company needing to
Mhm.
meet a due diligence regulation, you need to understand the risks throughout your supply chain.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Some of that supply chain may be certified, some of it probably not. So you're trying to gather information from both certified and non-certified supply chains.
Mhm.
Sustainability systems offer you a solution for that certified supply, but not
Yeah.
necessarily for the rest of your supply chain. So
Okay.
that's not a full solution for companies. So there's two things sustainability systems need to do. One is to focus on the interoperability of their traceability data. And
Mhm.
that's a really technical concept, but basically means how can my data talk with your data to ensure
Yeah.
that it
Okay.
all flows through the supply chain to the company so they get
Mhm.
that holistic picture. And the second thing they're doing then is looking at alternative or new traceability models that take
Okay.
account
Yeah.
not just of certified production, but also non-certified production that flows into
Yeah.
supply chains. So if you have mixing of product certified and non-product inputs, you
Mhm.
need to know not only what's the quality characteristics of that certified supply,
Yep.
but what happens is that non-certified supply also compliant with, say, in this
Mm.
case, EUDR is a good
Yeah.
example. And so the conversation about what kinds of traceability models work in
Mm.
that context is a really interesting current discussion.
I wonder if you could talk a little to how credibility helps drive the best practice on due diligence and just ISEAL's work and expertise in that space and quite how we're helping the due diligence pathways move forwards.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as you know, credibility is the core of what ISEAL is about. It's about supporting stakeholders to
Mhm. Yeah.
collectively define what good practice looks like. And I think we've seen from the decades of on the ground experience of sustainability systems just
Mhm.
what that credibility means in practice. And obviously we can talk about our credibility principles, things like transparency or stakeholder engagement, um, rigor
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
competence. Those are all critical factors. But in the context of due diligence, I think it is about giving companies assurance that the data that they are receiving or the
Hmm.
work that is being done in their supply chains is rigorous and mitigates the risk that they're trying to manage to fulfill
Okay.
their due diligence obligations. For sustainability systems, um, what credibility means really is,
Mm.
do they have the systems in place to support the effective and efficient implementation of their system in delivering
Okay.
sustainability impact? And I
Sure.
think that's ultimately what companies care about. If they look beyond just the risk management
Mm.
byline,
Mm.
then it really is about, okay, well, what impacts are we having and how can we best manage those? And I think sustainability systems, at least credible ones, are
Mm.
among the best placed tools to be able to do that.
I wonder if you could speak a bit to how we can give confidence to governments and business partners that sustainability systems are still really good, reliable tools to support due diligence, and
Yeah.
how that confidence can be more fully embedded.
Well, and I think this picks up nicely on the credibility piece. So
Mm.
just
Yeah, brilliant.
recognizing, the companies are facing increased expectations on what they need to do and what they're responsible for. And they're
Mhm.
looking for solutions. And there are many solution providers in the market, particularly newly emerging IT tools, supply chain mapping tools,
Mhm.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
promising, fairly robust solutions. But what we have with sustainability systems is the decades of experience on the ground, the
Sure. Yeah.
the already having mapped the supply chains. So having
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
transparency,
Yeah.
having the greatest amount of evidence that demonstrates the impact they're having. I mean, it, it's interesting whenever you get a new type of tool emerging.
Mm.
It's the latest greatest thing, and everyone's like, "Ooh, shiny new toy."
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when it
Yeah.
starts to be implemented in practice, all of the hiccups and the challenges that sustainability systems
Mm.
have faced
Mm.
come to the fore, and they recognize, oh, well, this isn't actually as easy as it seems.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
we go back and we say, well, sustainability systems have actually been through that challenge or addressed that problem. And this is how they've solved it. So they have the ability to, they're very practical, implementable tools and
Mhm.
scalable tools
Yeah.
that can meet the needs of companies and governments to provide those, both the credible solutions and ones that
Mhm.
are trustworthy. And I think it's that independence we haven't talked about, but that independence is a
Yeah.
key
Yeah. Yeah.
piece of that.
Yeah. Of course.
Um, and just the structures that they have in place to ensure the checks and balances and ensure the integrity and quality of the data that they provide or the certificates that they
Mhm.
communicate.
Yeah, fantastic. It's interesting you mentioned scalability there. A
Mm,
sense that I have is that sustainability systems are always in a very good spot to help raise the bar kind of beyond the regulatory response, beyond the due diligence. I just wonder if there's a piece there to briefly discuss
mm.
too about just how sustainability systems can help companies go further than they necessarily need to do just from what's written down in the rule books.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you have to assume that quite a number of companies are not doing this just to meet the
Yeah,
regulatory
yeah,
requirements, but they
yeah.
actually have an interest. And even if that's a risk mitigation interest in the first instance, there is still real value to building the sustainability and resilience of your supply
Mhm.
chains.
Yeah.
And I think sustainability systems have always been about going beyond legal compliance. And
Mhm.
one of the
Yeah, yeah.
strengths, there's a lot of focus now on specific sustainability issues. What's your climate impact, your nature
Mhm.
impact, livelihoods, or living income? That's great. And
Mm.
sustainability
Yeah.
systems have that holistic lens, that overall understanding that social issues, environmental issues, there's interplay and interconnectedness, and you can't have one without the other. And so a
Yeah.
standards framework tries to reflect how those issues interact and recognize that robust and durable sustainability impacts
Mm.
require a holistic perspective. So for systems, for companies that are using systems
Yeah.
for their due diligence obligations, great. You also get the added bonus of this
Mm.
holistic and actionable framework for sustainability.
Yeah, of course. And I'm sure that that's also a real bonus for, as you mentioned, those companies out there who, they're doing this because they want to, not necessarily because they have to.
Right.
The good, the keenest players out there, the sustainability systems can really help them do the most they want to do, which is great in this space. And that's what we want to see. I'm conscious our time is moving on, which is
Ah,
always
yes.
interesting, but that's always good. Maybe we'll move on to some, I guess, kind of broader themes just to start to wrap up the conversation.
Mhm.
I'm always intrigued by how due diligence and greenwashing have a certain interrelation. I don't know if it's a correlation or a conflict or an imbalance, but certainly those two themes, they have a something of a linkage. I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts
Absolutely.
on that and just how you feel, I guess how that dynamic is kind of playing out at the moment and maybe where it might be going in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you look to the EU as a prime example here, where
Mm,
both of those are examples of governments recognizing the need to uh, put rules in place for how
yeah,
companies
yeah.
operate. And from a consumer perspective, the Green Claims Directive, the Empowering
Mm,
Consumers Directive, other
mm,
green claims legislation worldwide, that is all about essentially extending truth in advertising to the
yeah,
sustainability
yeah.
space. But from a company perspective, it is about how do we how do companies ensure that they are doing a good job through due
Mhm.
diligence and
Yeah,
talking about it accurately
yeah.
through green claims. So the greenwashing and the due diligence legislation are both responses to how do
Mm.
we position companies to be better actors in the market.
Brilliant. Thank you, Patrick. It's been a fascinating conversation as always. I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you so much for tuning into our podcast on due diligence. And I really hope you found it inspirational and informative. And if you need any more information or you'd like to learn more about ISEAL and our work on credible sustainability systems, visit www.iseal.org.